poor rancher offered water to his Apache enemies. And that day, the war changed forever. Samuel Briggs had never seen war up close, but he'd lived most of his life on the edge of it. His small ranch sat on a patch of dry land that his father once claimed with a handshake and a promise, land that never yielded riches, only enough corn and cattle to keep them alive through drought and debt. After his family died to sickness and time, Samuel was the last Briggs left, a tired man in his 40s whose only companion was silence, a barking dog, and the lonely creak of his barn door in the wind. Yet even in that isolation, he knew the rumors. The Apache were moving. Villages burned. Soldiers killed. Families disappeared. But Samuel never believed all the stories white men told. He'd heard enough lies, spoken with God's name on them. Still, one thing was true. The Apache warriors were close. You could feel it in the stillness of the land, like the air itself was holding its breath. His well was drying slow, but it still had water, the only reason he stayed. That morning, as Samuel pulled up a bucket of water from the stone well outside his home, he heard the soft thump of hooves in the distance. No storm, no travelers. He turned and saw them. Apache riders, a whole line of them, moving like shadows against the rising light. And in front, walking on bare feet, a young Apache woman. Her face was marked with dirt, sweat, maybe blood. She was injured. He could see the dark stains smeared across her side where her hands pressed. Her black hair was braided with feathers and beads, and her eyes were so fixed and fearless they froze Samuel in place. Behind her, at least 15 warriors stopped at the edge of his fence, mounted, waiting, silent, rifles on their backs, spears in their grip, sun on their skin. Samuel's heart slammed in his chest, but his hands didn't shake. He didn't reach for his gun. The woman took one more step forward, her expression unreadable, and Samuel understood without a word being spoken. She needed water, not for her alone, for all of them. He'd heard the Apache didn't ask unless death stood behind them. Samuel looked at the well, looked at her, then back again. Something inside him, something older than all his fears, made the decision. He nodded once. His voice low, almost a whisper, he said, "Water's here." The warriors behind her didn't move, but their eyes sharpened. Samuel placed the bucket on the ground and stepped back. The woman stooped slowly, resisting a wince of pain, and cupped her hands into the water, lifting it to her lips. She drank like someone who hadn't tasted mercy in days. Then she looked back at her people and gave a small nod. One by one, the warriors dismounted. They formed a silent line, waiting their turn. Their eyes locked on Samuel, not with trust, not with hate, simply watching. Samuel didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He just stood there, breathing with them in the dust of a day that began like any other and was now changing the course of something bigger than any man alive. When the last warrior had drunk, the woman turned back to Samuel. She stood straight despite her wound. "Why?" she asked, her voice steady despite the pain. Samuel paused. "Because thirsts don't care who you are," he replied. "And neither should we." The woman stared at him a long time, her jaw tight with something like disbelief, or maybe respect. Then, with slow precision, she unhooked a beaded necklace from around her neck. It glimmered faintly in the sun. She held it toward him, and in that moment, Samuel didn't see an enemy. He saw a person who'd bled and walked through hell and still found it in her to honor. Someone who showed her people water. He didn't take the necklace. Instead, he nodded to her wound. "You should let me look at that," he said. The warriors tensed, hands tightening around weapons. But she held up her hand and they froze. Then, to Samuel's surprise, she stepped forward. He led her toward the small barn where there was shade, herbs, bandages, and the little knowledge he'd picked up from years of mending his own scars. The other warriors stayed outside, a wall of vigilance. Samuel cleaned her wound as carefully as he could. She never made a sound. As he worked, he realized she couldn't be more than 20, yet she carried herself like someone who had seen more war than he'd ever fear. When he tied the last knot on her bandage, she looked at him again. Something had shifted in her eyes. No smile, just a quiet knowing. "Your name?" she asked. "Samuel," he said. "Samuel Briggs." She nodded once. "I am Naira," she said. Then she rose and walked out into the sun, her people instantly surrounding her. None of them spoke another word. But before they rode away, each one looked back at Samuel. Not an enemy, not a friend, something in between. And when the dust cleared, Samuel didn't yet know that his act of humanity had just drawn a line in the land, one that would be crossed in blood and in unexpected loyalty, sooner than he could ever imagine. For 3 days after the Apaches rode away, Samuel Briggs felt the weight of silent eyes on his land, unseen, but there. The memory of Naira's gaze followed him like a ghost that refused to leave. He didn't know if they would return in peace or in war, but something deep inside him, something he had spent years burying under dust and work, stirred with a strange kind of hope. On the fourth day, just after dawn, the quiet was broken, not by hooves this time, but by gunfire. Samuel jolted awake and instinctively reached for the rifle on the wall as his dog barked wildly outside. 3 horses galloped past his fence. 2 men in blue coats slumped over them. U.S. cavalry scouts. Injured, bleeding into the dirt. Samuel ran toward them, pulling one man, barely conscious, off his saddle. "Indians," the soldier gasped. "They ambushed us." But when Samuel scanned the horizon, he didn't see Apache riders. Instead, he saw smoke far off, rising from the hills like a black wound stitching across the sky. He knew that smoke. It was a village burning. He could feel it in his bones. The army had found Naira's people, and they were burning them alive. Most men would have stayed out of it. Most would have thanked God the cavalry was near. But Samuel was long done living by most men's rules. He hoisted the wounded man into his barn, gave him water, tore his coat open, and paused when he saw his shoulder marked with a black emblem. A skull and dagger. He wasn't a scout. He was from the 19th Dragoons, the company known for wiping out native settlements without hesitation, men who shot women in the back and called it victory. Samuel's jaw tightened. He stepped back, watching the soldier's glazed eyes as he begged for water, as if he hadn't commanded flames on innocent lives. "You don't deserve it," Samuel said under his breath and walked away. There was no choice left. He knew what he had to do. Samuel saddled his old horse, grabbed a rifle, a canteen, and the beaded necklace that Naira had tried to give him. He didn't know if she was alive, but he knew she had trusted him once, and he wasn't about to let that trust die in smoke. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the soft brush of wind over brittle grass. By the time he reached the ridge overlooking the valley, the sight below cracked him open. Dozens of Apache corpses, their homes in ashes, wagons shattered, children standing without crying, as if tears were luxuries now lost forever. And there, on her knees, blood running down her arm, was Naira, her hair burned short in places, but her spine still straight. Samuel's heart twisted. She was alive, but behind her stood 2 cavalrymen, rifles aimed at her back, laughing like devils who mistook cruelty for bravery. Without thinking, Samuel slid down the ridge, loading a single round into his rifle. He took aim. 1 shot, clean. The first soldier dropped. The second turned, startled, and raised his gun. But Samuel was already on him, barefoot from the descent, crashing into him with a fury he didn't know he had left. They wrestled in dirt and blood until Samuel's hand found a rock, and the soldier's skull gave a sickening crack. Silence fell. Only fire popped behind them. Samuel stood, chest heaving, and when he finally turned to look at Naira, she was watching him not with shock, but something deeper. Recognition. Pain. Gratitude. She rose unsteadily, and though no words were spoken, Samuel understood. He wasn't just helping her. He was now part of whatever came next. The remaining Apache, wounded but alive, gathered slowly around her. Samuel didn't know what they'd do to him. Punish him. Spare him. Test him. Kill him. But Naira stepped forward and laid a hand on his chest over his heart. "Today," she said softly, "you are not one of them. Today you are with us." Then she turned to her people and shouted, something in their language. The tone was fierce. The response was louder. They began to move, tending to their wounded, gathering what little they could save, preparing for the long road. Ahead, Samuel stood still, breathing in smoke, blood, and the undeniable certainty that there was no way back to his old life. When Naira approached him again, she handed him the beaded necklace. This time he took it. Slowly he tied it around his neck. Not as thanks, not as honor, but as a binding between a man who once stood alone and a people who now walked with him toward a future written in fire. And somewhere deep in the ruins of the valley, beneath ash and bone, something changed forever. Not just in the land, not just in the war, but in the soul of a man who chose to offer water instead of bullets, and found himself transformed into something legend might one day whisper of, a poor rancher who dared to treat his enemies like human beings, and in doing so, became more than a witness to history. He became part of the storm that would follow,